Good morning and welcome to this week's Grow, where we gather to recharge, organize, and work here as members of MWEG. We're excited to continue our media literacy series with our Director of Media Literacy, Meredith Gardner. Today we're going to talk about book banning. That's something that's been in the news lately and something that we've seen a lot about on social media. Meredith is going to talk to us and what that entails, what that looks like, and how we can have peaceful conversations, maybe with information about the books that are coming up and how we can talk to people that have feelings about that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Meredith.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Okay. So today, like Rachel said, we're going to talk about book banning and book censorship. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that this is a really emotionally fraught issue. There's a lot of varying opinions on this, and it can be really polarizing. So I'm hoping today that we can learn what book censorship is, what's happening with it, statistically speaking, what the different legal issues are surrounding it, and find a way to peacefully work through this issue. So there's a few things I want to talk about today. First of all, what is book censorship, book banning? What does it look like in today's landscape? We've been hearing a lot about it in the news, as Rachel mentioned. Also, what is a parent's role, or what should a parent do if a parent notices a book isn't appropriate for their kids and, maybe they got it from the school library? And then also, what can any adult do to encourage good, what do I want to say? To encourage peacemaking around this issue in their community and engage with it productively. So we're going to dive right in. I also want to say, I guess I will start out with a personal story about this. I'm a mom of 5 kids. I live in Texas. There's a lot of book banning discussion that's happening in Texas right now. I'll show you a map of where book censorship is happening most in the country. In Texas, it's ground zero. And I have 5 kids, ages 2 to 15. And I have had times when I have had to tell my kids that a book isn't appropriate for them. One small example, many years ago, when one of my oldest children was in, I want to say in 2nd or 3rd grade, so they were probably 9-ish, they were really an advanced reader, and a teacher recommended that they read a book series that I considered meant for older kids. It's a really popular dystopian series. I won't name it because I don't want people to get into argument about whether that would be appropriate for a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old, like a 2nd or 3rd grader. But I did not feel it was appropriate for her. So we were at this parent-teacher conference. The teacher said, she's a super advanced reader. I'm not sure what to give her to read. I was thinking about having her read this series. And my husband and I were immediately said, we don't feel like that's appropriate for our daughter. Can we find something else that would be more appropriate? So we consulted with her, and we consulted with some other teacher friends and found her a different, a different series or different set of books that would be appropriate for her. So that's just one example that I have for my personal life. So I can totally relate to people who feel like there are certain books that aren't appropriate for their kids. I think any parent can relate to that. And I'll relate back to that story and another story I have later on in this, but I just kind of wanted to lay that groundwork. Okay. There. Okay. Wanted to make sure my slideshow's working. First, we're going to talk about what is a book challenge. So a book challenge is a process. It's typically outlined by a school district or a public library system. Most school districts nowadays have a formal system in place that if a parent feels like a book that's in the school curriculum or the library or in a public library, they can go to that organization and say, I don't feel this book is appropriate. Will you please review it? And typically the result of that is either We've heard about some school districts restricting access to that book. So they might move it from an elementary library to a middle school library, or they may remove the book, or they may say, we have no problem with this book. It can stay here. The problem with book challenges, and the reason why librarians are so cautious to limit books in their libraries, is because books are carefully curated by librarians. And I'm not saying that there's never selections that parents can take issue with, but they typically are curated pretty carefully to expose children to a variety of ideas and to make sure different viewpoints and demographics are included. And when we challenge books or we try to restrict them, it also limits the marketplace of ideas in our society and what kids are exposed to. So we have to be really cautious of that, of limiting that marketplace of ideas, because once we do that, we start to veer into violating the First Amendment. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. I want to share part of a slide deck we made several months ago. You can find this on our public Facebook page or on our Instagram account. It's about book bans. And books are often banned with good intentions, generally. Book banning has happened from all political backgrounds. All kinds of groups have tried to limit books and ideas throughout history. And it's typically to shelter children or from groups of people from information that might be challenging or inoffensive, or what some people might view as age inappropriate. It has been used historically to limit dissenting or minority points of view as well. So it can become very dangerous. And I think that's why a lot of people are concerned about it. Books that are banned often include one or more of the following. It could be racial issues, sexual content is big, LGBTQ issues, religion, profanity, drug use. I've seen all kinds of things. I actually live close to a county in Texas that was the county board was trying to shut down the library over, I think it was like close to a dozen books that people felt were inappropriate in the library. And I was really surprised by the range of issues these books covered. I think one of them dealt with, anti-Nazism. One of them was about like bodily functions that maybe parents would find that offensive, but just a whole range of issues. It's really interesting if you have time to look in your area and to find out what types of books are being challenged. I think you would find that really interesting. Is it ever appropriate to ban a book? So it's important to know that censorship generally violates the First Amendment. And so courts have ruled that public officials can ban books that are obscene or pornographic according to community standards. And the part that's tricky about that is the according to community standards part, because people disagree on what is truly obscene or pornographic. And when libraries review a book, they are supposed to take a holistic view and when they review the book, and not just take one passage out of context. And that can lead to a lot of disagreements on whether a book is appropriate for a certain population, like children or teenagers. What we currently know about book censorship is that it is on the rise. So these are statistics that come from the American Library Association, which tracks book censorship. And as you can see, I think there was a dip in 2020 because of the pandemic. But if you look over the average, from 2003 to 2012, it looks like there was about in the 400s, 450 attempts to ban or restrict library materials per year was the average. And you can see that in 2021, it started really spiking up. So we went up to 729 and then 1,269 in 2022. So that's a huge jump. The number of unique titles challenged also went through a huge jump. So you saw about 200 unique titles in 2015, and then that spiked to 2,571 in 2022. So once again, a huge jump. So we know this is a big issue. that is on top of people's minds. And you might, wonder what kinds of books, or where is this happening, or why is this happening? And we'll talk about all those things. So book censorship, where is it taking place? This is from the American Library Association as well. And it's just a heat map, and it shows, so the darker colors are where more titles have been challenged. So I live in Austin, Texas. There's tons of book censorship discussions happening in Texas. There's actually a lawsuit happening between the state and some private booksellers about it. But we have, it's the darkest color. But you can see other states where this has been a big issue. Censorship takes place almost like a 50-50 split between schools and public libraries. So I believe the difference in schools and school libraries is the 10% for schools is books that are in curriculum versus books that are in circulation in the library. So there's usually a different way schools handle books that are within the curriculum versus what the librarian orders and goes into circulation in the library. And they usually handle those challenges a little bit differently.
Meredith, I have a question about this chart. Just because the percentage is so high on public libraries, I'm wondering, is the ratio maybe skewed because public libraries have a larger content and volume of books? Or
are you surprised by how many are challenged at public libraries?
A little bit I am, maybe because I feel like, and this is my personal opinion, of feeling like the public library should have less biases of what is out there and let the readers make their choice of what's available, versus let's just ban it, not make it available to anybody, and it's not in the public library system. Like, I feel like the public library has so many resources that should be for everybody of all thoughts and all backgrounds and experiences, and for us to be able to learn about each other and those different experiences, if we are curious to know, I feel like the public library maybe is a place that we should have better access to those kind of things. Now, that's not saying that if there's books that are being challenged, like you were saying, that they're not put in the correct locations within the library that are age appropriate, like you were saying, or whatnot. And I think that there's a great value in using librarians for resources of saying, well, what do you think? I'm looking for information on this. Can you guide me? And then they can kind of give you an idea and give you a little more background about some of the publications. But I am a little bit surprised that so many, but maybe I just wonder if it's based on volume of what's available.
That could be part of it, but let me clarify, because you bring up a lot of really good points. So this is the number of challenges that have taken place. So that doesn't necessarily mean that like 48% of books that have been banned in libraries. These are just the number of challenges, so like complaints about a book that people have received. So 48% of those book challenges have been received by public libraries. If that makes sense, does that clarify a little bit?
Yeah, that does make sense. It makes sense that that's the number of challenges. I'm just surprised that high of a percentage rate is challenged at a public library.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like, absolutely. I can see that parents would be more concerned of what's in their children's schools. But I just feel like the public library is for the public. It's not just for it's not just for parents. It's not just for kids. There's so many of us. So the challenges. But I'd also be interested, maybe you have information of 48% were challenged. How many of them are still there, even though they were challenged? So.
Well, that is a really good question. I don't have the answer to that because I think they don't know the number of that were specifically banned, because some of them are still in process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does.
Yeah. So we don't know how many books were actually taken off the shelf. Unless, people or the library specifically reports it. And some of them, like I said, this is from 2022. So some of them may still be in process. I don't know how long, it depends on how long what their process is for reviewing books. So I would hope it wouldn't take more than a few months, but I really don't know. All really good questions and thoughts. So thank you, Rachel. Okay. Why are the requests to censor books increasing? So I found this to be a really interesting statistic. So the American Library Association said that, let me find the direct quote. So prior to 2021, the majority of book challenges that libraries received were for removal or restriction of a single book. Okay. So the vast majority were for one book. And starting in 2022, 90% of book censorship requests were for multiple titles. So, and almost, I'm looking at the statistics now, 80% of the cases were for 10 to 100 plus books. So they made these requests and they wrote a list of anywhere from 10 to over 100 books on their list. So I find that to be super interesting, like that not only are more book titles, but it's many, many books in one request. They said 40% of cases of book challenges were for 100 or more books at a time. So they said that requests to censor books are likely increasing in part because of organized groups that are compiling lists of books to target. So it's not that necessarily people are actually going out and reading these books and they're saying, I don't feel like they're appropriate. Maybe in some cases they are, but it's because there are certain groups out there that are saying parents need to go out and ask all of these books to be removed, or community members should ask for all of these books to be removed from libraries. So there's kind of these mass requests that libraries are dealing with. I found that really interesting. What types of books are being targeted? I found this information interesting too. So this comes from PEN America, which is a First Amendment rights organization. And 41% of books that were flagged for banning had LGBTQ themes, protagonists, or secondary characters. 40% had protagonists or prominent secondary characters of color. 22% had sexual content, and that could vary from like thinking about sexual acts to maybe someone who was sexually assaulted. There's just a wide range in there. 21% dealt with issues of race and racism, 10% about rights and activism, 9% biography, autobiography, memoir, and 4% featured religious minorities. So that gives you kind of a view of what types of books are being banned. And then they have the date range here between July 1st and June 30th, 2022. So I want to talk a little bit about another series, thinking about what books are being banned, about the importance of diverse books. And this is a great series that was actually put together by an MWEG volunteer. I want to give her credit. Her name is Georgia Bennell, and she actually has a PhD in literacy education. And she did some really great research on why books and having diverse books available to everyone is so important. And she came across this research that was made by a literacy expert named Radine Sims Bishop. And she said that people benefit from access to books that act as mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. So books that are mirrors reflect our own culture or our own physical characteristics. So if someone has a disability, they benefit from books about people with disabilities. If someone is a person of color, they benefit from books that are about their own experience. So that affirms their existence and place in society. Windows are books that offer us a view of another aspect of the world. So I don't have a physical disability. I recently bought my kids a book about a child that does have a physical disability so that they can have that window into what it would be like to be, that child. It's a situation that's unfamiliar to them. And so that's why I bought that book. Books as sliding glass doors are books that offer not only a view of the unfamiliar, but that inspire us to actually go out and change the world. So I love this philosophy of how books can benefit us. And this is so important because if readers can't find themselves in the text that they read, they often don't feel like they're important in their communities. I can't imagine how it would feel, if part of my identity, if I couldn't find any books about me in my school library, in my public library, I would really feel left out. I don't know that I've had that experience, but I can consider it and feel like I can see how people would feel left out in that. Also, much of what people read, especially in the case of children, helps them understand parts of the world they don't experience. And it teaches them compassion and understanding and acceptance of other people. So I think most people would agree that diverse books are really important. And I love this philosophy on why. So with that in consideration, something that's important to know about the American Library Association and their position on book censorship. Obviously, they take a very strong position because this is their professional experience. And they say librarians and governing bodies should maintain that parents and only parents have the right and the responsibility to restrict the access of their children and only their children to library resources. So I think that's what makes this situation tricky, is because I think there are people who legitimately feel like there are books that are not appropriate for any child and that no child should read those books. However, there's parents that would disagree with those people and say, actually, I do feel comfortable with my kid reading that book, and it actually helps them feel seen and understood. So I feel like that's kind of where the sticking point is and where a lot of the disagreement is. For me, in my experience that I shared about my daughter and not being comfortable with her reading that book series, I didn't go to the school and say, I don't think you should read. I don't think you should allow other kids to read these books. They're not appropriate. Because they weren't appropriate for my daughter at that time, but that didn't mean they weren't appropriate for other children. Does that make sense? And I wouldn't judge parents if they let their kids read those books at that age, because that's up to that parent to decide.
Right.
So I
And
think that's what
Meredith,
the library is getting at.
I also think that what you're saying is it might not have been appropriate for your daughter at that time, but as she matures, right?
Yes.
That when she's a little bit older, you might suggest that series to her. You're not saying never. You're just
Right.
saying not now, like this is too mature or what not.
Absolutely.
And but when she gets older, then yeah, we'll revisit this when she has the maturity to handle such subjects, right? But I love this reasoning, and I really feel like we need to trust librarians. They know more about what's there, at least the ones that I've come in contact with. And I have a pretty healthy relationship with my public library and my kids, that I feel like I can trust their suggestions and resources when we go and ask for some help. So I think it's a good resource to get to know your teachers, get to know the librarians, get to know the people that are doing this research, so that there's a level of trust too, right?
Absolutely. Yes, definitely. That's so important, is to feel like you can be involved. And I think that most librarians would welcome that, and teachers. They want parents to be involved, and they appreciate that involvement and those questions, and they want your child to have a good experience and to be exposed to lots of different ideas and learning opportunities, but they also want to make sure that they're meeting everyone's needs. So yeah, absolutely. When it comes to the First Amendment, there are Supreme Court cases that deal with access to learning materials and students and book censorship. So censorship by librarians is constitutionally protected excuse me, let me start over with that. Censorship by librarians of constitutionally protected speech, whether for protection or for any other reason, violates the First Amendment. So it's really important to know that, like, librarians legally can't just remove a book from a collection because somebody doesn't like it. Students' First Amendment rights, including the right to access information and ideas, should not be violated. That's a Supreme Court decision as well. It says, let me see what it says. Students have should have the right to access information and ideas. So that's part of their First Amendment rights, is to receive access to information and ideas. And even students in a public school system have that right, without interference from other adults. Okay, and that's not to say that schools don't make accommodations from parents sometimes, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it is a First Amendment issue. Having access to ideas is part of freedom of speech and expression. So it's a really important part of what makes our democracy work. What about speech that is not protected? So obscenity is a type of speech that is not considered protected by the First Amendment. The thing about obscenity, let me read you what the Supreme Court has said. Is what they currently use is called the Miller test. And it was established in a case called Miller versus California. And so the test for obscenity under the Miller test includes the following criteria. It's whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work or the book taken as a whole appeals to prurient interest. So does it have value? Does the work as a whole have value? Whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. So it has to depict sexual content that is specifically precluded by the state law, and whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So that's the test. And you can see, as you think about that test, it's got to holistically view the work. Does it contain, dialogue or scenes that are against the law? And is it lacking in literary, artistic, political, or scientific value? And that's a big test to meet. So it becomes really difficult for schools. You'll hear parents read passages. I have in my area, there's a neighboring school district that was in the news a lot in a year or two ago about book banning, and parents would go to the school board meeting and they would read very specific passages from these books, and they did seem like really graphic. And yet in some cases the books were not removed from the school district, and it's because the work did not lack literary value. So that section maybe felt a little risky and or inappropriate even, but the work had literary value, and so it was kept. So I think some parents were really offended by that. But it's important to know the legal background of that and why those kind of books may have stayed.
Yeah, and I think, Meredith,
Yeah.
sometimes in those cases where they're pulling out very, very specific text, it's they're not giving it context.
Yes.
Right. And so that those words and paragraph may be read out of context. And that may be why these books weren't pulled, because
Yes.
when they were looked at it in a broader sense, in the context of how it was written, it really wasn't put into, it wasn't in a threatening way or whatever. But I think that that's important, not to focus on a few sentences of an entire literary piece and when they're taken out of context. So that's always something that I've noticed and thought, well, I don't know this book and I don't know what, and I, when I've seen things like that on the news, is I'm thinking, I don't know this book, but I also don't know what this whole thing is referring to. And so I feel like, how can anybody make a decision based on just this very minute part of a book?
Yes.
When it's all taken out of context.
Absolutely. And then I've heard some people talk about, well, if you're not okay banning this book or that book, then you must support giving pornography to children. And so I just wanted to put a definition of pornography on here, because most there are very few books that are actual pornography. And so you might have something in there that you feel is like sexually explicit or inappropriate, maybe for a specific age group. But pornography does have a definition, and hardcore pornography is illegal in many states, and most books don't actually fit that criteria. So it's important to know that when we use those kind of loaded accusations, that's not typically accurate. We're not typically, most books in school libraries aren't actually pornography directed at children. So I just wanted to make that point as well. Does this mean that kids can check out anything? So in short, the answer is actually yes, which is really interesting. And I didn't know that before I was preparing for this. But as I was researching, professional standards of librarianship affirm unrestricted access to the privacy of library users. And so that means that librarians, if a kid comes in and they're looking for a book on a specific topic, the librarian is going to direct that kid toward books that are age appropriate for that child. They're not going to direct them to the adult section, right? But if a child ends up coming, and has like a Stephen King book, the librarian's not going to tell the child they can't check it out. Hope that makes sense. Like, a librarian isn't going to specifically steer kids towards books that are not for their age level, but they won't prohibit them from checking them out either. As in the case of public schools, you hear a little bit about some schools are allowing parents to call and say, I don't want my kid to check out this book and this book and this book. And once again, that gets a little sticky legally. But I know some librarians are doing it. They're saying, yes, I will try to prohibit your child from checking out that book. That becomes a complicated situation for several reasons, and I won't get into all of them. One of them can be just that it can be awkward to tell a kid as they bring up a book, actually, I'm really sorry, you can't check that out. Your parent called. You know what I mean? That puts the librarian in a difficult situation of knowing how to tell their child about that. But it's also not a guarantee. Like, a librarian can't promise that a kid will never read a book that's in a library. I know my child, my oldest child, is in high school, and she likes to eat lunch in the library. And she doesn't necessarily check out a book, but she reads in there. And, any kid can go in the library and read a book without checking it out. So they can't guarantee that just because you ask for a restriction on a book for your child, they can't guarantee they will follow through with that. So it's important to remember and important to keep in mind. So we're going to talk about some things you can do instead. So first of all, what is the role of a parent? As I mentioned before, parents have the right to restrict their own child's book, keeping in mind that every parent is not going to agree with which books are appropriate for which children. Okay, so I will give you an example. So when one of my kids was 10, we were at the public library, and she was starting to look at books in the YA section because she was a pretty advanced reader. She brought me a book and asked if she could check it out. And I flipped through the book, and I found some parts that I felt like for a 10-year-old were pretty explicit and pretty inappropriate for her age. And so at that point, I told her, thanks for asking. I've looked through it. We can't check out this book today. But can I help you find something about this topic that would be more for your age? So that's a situation that I feel like any parent could do. I'm not going to say that book is inappropriate for all teens, and maybe there's some parents who would have let a 10-year-old check out that book and would have disagreed with me, as I mentioned before. Adults aren't going to agree on what's appropriate for their children versus another parent's children. And that's okay. We will have different opinions, and we have to be willing to sit in that disagreement and in that tension and allow parents to make decisions for their own children about what's appropriate and what's not. Sorry, my computer is acting up a little bit. Okay, so how can parents be proactive in this situation? It's really important for families to discuss their value around media use, not just books, but any media, and how to recognize good media versus inappropriate media. So we have discussions about recognizing inappropriate media, recognizing pornography with our kids, and what they should do if they feel uncomfortable with it. And I will say that for the most part, like my kids do a pretty good job of self-monitoring and noticing when something makes them feel uncomfortable and turning it off or not finishing it, not finishing the book, taking it back to the library, that kind of thing. So it's just really important. Kids will overwhelmingly follow their family values, but parents have to tell their kids what those values are. So they have to be involved. Talk to your kids about what they're reading. If your kid wants to read a book that you're not sure about, think about previewing it. I have to say, with the banned book lists, I'm totally reading my way through the banned books list right now so that I can be aware of, like, if my kid wants to read, I mean, I've read To Kill a Mockingbird. That's a commonly banned book, unfortunately. But if my kid wants to read The Bluest Eye, for example, by Toni Morrison, I have not read that yet, but it's on my list. I want to know what's in it and what, if there's a part maybe I should warn them about, or if there's something we can discuss about it afterward. Parents, no parent's going to be perfect at this, but it's a great opportunity to have a discussion with your kids about the kinds of things they're reading. If you think a book is inappropriate for them, explain why. Tell them maybe you think like it's a little too explicit. Maybe there's a lot of bad language in it. And then maybe help them find a book on that same topic that's more appropriate. Consider whether letting your child read a controversial book could be a valuable tool for critical thinking. So if a book isn't age inappropriate, but you're just maybe uncomfortable with the topic of it, maybe that's a book that you and your child could read together and you can discuss and, kind of flesh out those issues together. And that can be a really great learning experience to see where your views with your child coincide and maybe where they differ and why. How can any adult productively engage with this issue? Any adult can do this. Learn about your school district and public libraries' policies on book challenges. As I mentioned before, most school districts and public libraries now have a specific policy, if they didn't have one before, on book challenges. It's important to be aware of what's going on in your local area, because there are a lot of reports of especially like school administrators circumventing these policies. I just read an article recently about how a lot of like principals are going around their school libraries and pulling books off shelves without consulting librarians. So books are just disappearing because they see, oh, this book is on a commonly banned book list and I don't want to deal with this if parents find out, so I'm just going to remove it. That's actually typically, goes against district policies. So find out what their policies are. You can even have a conversation with your principal about where they stand on this. And then volunteer to be part of curriculum or book review committees. So I remember we moved to Texas in 2020, and when we moved here, they were doing a curriculum review and they were like begging parents to get involved. I don't think they would have to do as much begging now because there's such an interest in this topic. But I know districts are often looking for parents to read through books that they are considering putting on the curriculum or in the library and give their feedback. So if you have time, volunteer to be part of that process, and be a part of the solution there. Be proactive about it. Learn about what types of books are being challenged and banned in your area. I mentioned that a little bit before. I'm pretty sure that any librarian, if you went to them, would be willing to tell you what types of books they're seeing most challenged. I would be really interested to hear those statistics, and I might do that. I'm probably going to go to the library later this week, finding that out from my own librarian. And that can help you kind of understand what culturally is happening in your area and what you should be aware of. You can also attend school and county board meetings where book challenges are being discussed. And there's a really great guide for adults that the American Library Association offers on how to do that, how to engage with that at school district meetings and county board meetings. And then report book removals. If you hear about a book being removed from a school library or a public library, there's groups that are trying to collect data on that, like Pen America and the American Library Association. So be sure to try to report those if you see it, and they do sift through and make sure they don't have duplicates, but that's really helpful to them. I just wanted to close with something positive. I loved this poster that I found from the National Book Festival, Open a Book, Open the World. I just think that books are so powerful, and we are so fortunate to live in a country that values the free exchange of ideas. And the free exchange of ideas is so important to maintaining our democracy and making good decisions as a community. And I just hope that we can keep that in mind as we try to navigate these issues and try to peacefully understand where everyone is coming from on this issue. I hope this was helpful. And I hope that, as we go forward into the school year, we can be proactive on this issue within our own family and within our communities. That's what I have. Do you have any other questions, Rachel?
One question I do have is there a resource that you might steer people towards that you feel is what's the word, is legitimate for people to go, and maybe if they just want the quick, like, I want to know what this book is about, like, if you're looking through the banned book list and you're like, I've never even heard of any of these books, I don't understand, and like, where would you send people? Like, let's just go get a synopsis of what each of these books is about, to get kind of an idea of why would they even be on the list, and why, that kind of a thing. Is there something that you would recommend? Maybe we can put it in the Facebook discussion group in the comments as a resource, like, hey, if you have questions about a book, here's a resource for you to go and maybe learn a little bit more about it before you make a decision. I mean, without reading it, right? So I know there's like you have Goodreads, and people will give their opinions on Goodreads, and Goodreads will usually do a little a blurb summary about the book. I think there's another one. Is it Spark Notes? Are you familiar with that one?
I'm not familiar with that one. I'm trying to find the other one that I've used before, and people can kind of like flag a book for different content. That's a good question. I might have to do a little looking and put it in the comment section. I know that one thing, actually I was talking to a friend about this before I gave this presentation. She said that her daughter enjoys reading a variety of books, but doesn't want books that are spicy. And that's kind of the current lingo for like sexual content. So her daughter will just like Google a book title and the word spicy, and it will tell her, she'll find information on whether that book is too spicy for her liking. I often will just Google the book title, and if it's banned, you can usually find an article that will tell you why it's banned, with excerpts and things like that. But yeah, there's definitely like a Goodreads similar, and I can't think of the name of it right now, but I will find it, that does flag different types of content. There's also Common Sense Media does a lot of book reviews, is another really good resource.
That's good to know. We've used that for movies and different things, but I haven't actually thought of going there to see if they do books. So that's also, I know that's a really good resource that a lot of parents trust. But yeah, we can put those after looking into it a little bit. And if anybody watching this in the Facebook discussion group kind of has some suggestions of places or websites that they like to go and find information, to kind of get a summary of books and that kind of thing, please feel free to include that. And if you we want things that you've used not just like, oh, I Googled it and saw this, but if you have something
Yeah.
that you've used that has been helpful to you, some tools. But there's so many great points. And a lot of things when it comes to literacy and these kind of things and academics, and so much of it, and you touched on this, so much of it has to do in the home. It's where does it start? What are the rules? What are the standards in your home, and what kind of discussions are you having, so that when kids come up on it, they can make a decision and they get to say, yeah, I'm going to keep reading this because I'm curious and I want to see how this plays out, or this feels uncomfortable and I don't want to continue down this story, so I'm gonna just give up on this book and I'll move on to something else. It's something that we need, but I think that it's also a personal decision, and that's something that people need to choose what they read, and there might be different things, and like we were saying, that we want that, the whole, like, seeing the mirror, the window, the sliding glass door is such an important thing. I do know that our reading specialist at our school I had one of my kids struggled with reading a little bit, and so she'd aged out of getting help from the reading specialist, really. And so just because I had a relationship with her, I said, hey, if I set up a little book club for you and her, like, you guys can read this book together, maybe she can pull in a friend, will you pull books for her? And then when you guys finish the book and you have your discussion, I'll bring in lunch, right? So this was just something I set up as a parent, knowing that I wanted my child to read. And one of the books they chose was definitely The Window, like showing somebody about her same age, same grade, who was going through something hard, who was being teased about, like, a disability or something that they had, and how they overcame it and how people learned. And I just thought, and so I really appreciate, like, when you go and ask, and I love book groups for that, because you get to hear perspectives, and people will say, oh, I really like this book. Oh, if you like this, then maybe you might like reading that. And so then it's that level of trust of, oh, I trust these people that I'm in a book group with, that would share other, references of other books that I might like on certain topics. So those are all kind of things to consider when you're choosing books, but also, when it comes to banning books, like,
Absolutely.
I think we need to be open to it before we jump on that train and just cut and paste a list into a letter to our school board and say, oh, well, all these books were suggested that we ban them, so I want you to ban them too. So
Yeah. And I mean, I think that I saw a quote that was something about, I wish I would have pulled it and included it in my notes, but like, if they're a library, it's a good library if there's something in it to offend everyone. And like, there's tons of books in my library that I would never read, whether it's because I don't like the book or because maybe I find the topic, offensive, or the content offensive. But I don't want to prohibit other people from making that choice, and there's this great quote that was from Barack Obama. He wrote a letter to librarians recently, and he said that the free, robust exchange of ideas has always been a part of the heart of American democracy, and together we can make that true for generations to come. So I just feel like this whole battle about books kind of we forget that it's not just about protecting people, it's also about the health of our democracy. And we kind of have to take that whole broad look as we, make decisions about it and become involved with it. So
yeah, that letter to the librarians was quite endearing. And
yeah,
if you know a librarian, go give them a hug and be like,
absolutely, it's a hard time to be a librarian.
Thanks for doing the best you can, and we appreciate you for reading the books and doing the research and giving us suggestions. So, well, thank you, Meredith. Thank you for doing today's Grow. We hope that everybody gets some information from this. And like we said in the Facebook discussion group, you can share some suggestions of ways that people can go and get more information. And we just want to make clear, don't go in there and, and say, well, this is,
Engage
we want it
peacefully.
to be a peaceful discussion, and how we can, like, learn more about books and the appropriateness. So thank you for being here, and we will see you guys next time. Have a good day. Bye.